YouTube, what is up, everybody? Doomwake here, and welcome to another Banlist prediction. It is that time of the year again. We recently had one in August, and in that announcement, back in August, which is when they unbanned Preordain, which I would say overall has been a net positive to the health of the format. But in that announcement, they did mention that they were going to be doing new announcements for 2 weeks after the release of each set, and those specific announcements would be more likely to impact Eternal formats. Well, they did say in that announcement that October 16th was going to be the next one of these 2 weeks after the release, and here we are tomorrow. This is recording this on Sunday. Tomorrow is October 16th. Now, I will say, first of all, they mentioned that it was going to be, I believe they said 2 weeks after the release of the set. We're 5 weeks into Wilds of Eldraine. Now, granted, we don't necessarily have to believe everything WotC says about ban the restricted announcement timings, because we all know how that's happened in the past. But in any case, whatever the case may be, we are, I believe, should be getting an announcement tomorrow. So I wanted to make a prediction video because there's been a lot of chatter over the past couple of weeks on Twitter. We'll get into the discussion a little bit, but there's been talks about Scam, there's been talks about Four Color, and I have some relatively strong opinions on what I think should and, maybe ultimately what I think will happen with the ban list tomorrow. So let's get started with the first culprit. Now, it wouldn't be a ban list episode if we didn't first talk about the elephant in the room, or maybe in this case, the elemental in the room, and that is the card you see on your screen, Grief. So what this is in reference to is the Ratos Scam, or Ratos Evoke, depending on where you are in the world, whatever you want to call it. But the Ratos deck that is trying to play Grief on turn 1, use an effect like Not Dead After All or Undying Evil to get it back from the graveyard into the battlefield with a +1/+1 in some fashion, and rip 2 cards out of your opponent's hand. Now, as far as metagame share, I'm looking at, this is just MTG Goldfish, which sometimes their data can be a little skewed because they tend to include like other forms of Rakdos deck that aren't necessarily the, kind of all-in Grief decks. But in any case, they have Rakdos midrange at 21.4% of the metagame. I remember seeing on Twitter a couple of days ago, and you can fact check this on the Goldfish page, there was a top 32 of one of the recent challenges. There were 14 Rakdos decks in the top 32. And to be quite honest with you, we haven't really seen this type of metagame representation, honestly, since the Valky Cascade decks. Now, look, I'm not trying to tell you that Rakdos Scam or Rakdos Evoke is even close to the same power level as Valky Cascade. That's not what the argument here is. But it's getting to a point where it is becoming an overwhelming percentage of the metagame, to the point where people kind of feel forced to play it. I've heard a lot of people, say post on Twitter about their RCQ results that they didn't want to play Scam, but they kind of felt pressured into it because they know how busted the deck is. And then from a gameplay standpoint, look, okay, when the Rakdos deck, when it opens on Grief plus Not Dead After All on the play, there is almost no deck in the format that can safely say they have a good matchup against getting turn 1 double griefed, because you get to rip 2 of the best cards out of your opponent's hand. If there's any sort of follow-up, whether it's a Bowmaster, a Ragavan, a Dothi Voidwalker, literally any spell cast after that, it just creates an immediate, basically 3-turn clock. And I think a lot of the frustration with this Rakdos deck comes from this specific card. I'm not exactly sure what the intention was when they designed this card. Yes, they understood that people were going to be casting it for free, but I'm wondering if maybe they didn't quite realize how well this worked with the blink or reanimate effects, stuff like Not Dead After All, Ephemerate, so on and so forth. So yeah, I think a lot of people's frustration really boils down to this exact card. And personally, I really think the format would be quite a bit better off if this card were banned. So that's, as far as my prediction is concerned, that is going to be number 1 on my list. Grief, you're gone. Okay, so if we had done this video last week, I think that my answers would be a little bit different, and I maybe could have even stopped the video at just Grief. But I don't know if you guys have heard of this guy. He's called Aspiring Spike. He streams sometimes on twitch.tv, and he has a tendency to break things. So he has created this Up the Beanstalk Cascade deck, which has just had this overwhelming metagame share and representation over the past couple of days. There was actually a big finish. Tristan JWL on Magic Online, who top aided the Modern Showcase with a variant of Spike's deck. It was a little bit different, but the goal of this deck, it's very similar to other 4-color decks that you may have seen in the past, utilizing Cascade engines like Shardless Agent and, to a lesser extent, Bloodbraid Elf in certain variants. But basically, you use Shardless and you play Up the Beanstalk and no other copies of anything that costs less than 3 mana, so you're always cascading into Up the Beanstalk, generating a ton of value with those pitch elementals like Fury and Solitude, Leyline Binding as well. Also, a 1-mana spell that happens to trigger Up the Beanstalk. So that's kind of the new craze here. But so I think that if you're choosing, if you have come to the conclusion that you want to ban Grief from the format because of all the headaches that it causes and people's just general perception about the card and how roughly negative it is, and it leads to very unfun gameplay patterns, I think that you also kind of have to address this 4-color deck. Now, weirdly enough, I actually think that it almost feels like over the past week, Grief has kind of felt like the good guy because this 4-color deck has just been just shredding through everybody. And I really think that if you are choosing to ban a card from the Scam deck, you also kind of have to realize what sort of domino effect that's going to have on the rest of the format. And for that reason, I think you are almost required to ban something from the 4-color deck, because otherwise, if you remove the best deck in the format, that 4-color metagame share just basically just absorbs all of, maybe not all of it, but you get what I'm saying. Just because the Rakdos deck is, maybe sort of a natural backstop, and the grief draws that the 4-color deck can sometimes struggle with. But yeah, I really think you do have to address the 4-color deck. Now, a lot of people had been asking before Up the Beanstalk and before Wilds of Eldraine came out for a banning of the One Ring. Now, I think that there's a couple of reasons why I wouldn't necessarily think that they're going to ban the ring, and they're not rooted into gameplay. So first and foremost, the ring, I don't want, it's a conversation that we have to have. The ring is really expensive. It's about $50 or $60 for a cheap copy. And I think that they have a very strong tendency. Again, there are exceptions, Mox Opal, so on and so forth. But they have more of a tendency to try to avoid not banning the ridiculously expensive cards if they can avoid it. If there is another ban that makes sense from a deck perspective, and a lot of people have been saying that Up the Beanstalk is just better than the One Ring anyways. At least that's kind of been the sentiment over the past week or so. And then the other reason is because they're doing a re-release of Lord of the Rings, I believe, either next month or the month after. And I'm pretty sure that the ring is going to be in that re-release, so it'd be kind of awkward to ban a card, then re-release it, and there's just a lot of problems that it causes. So if I was, tasked with changing the ban list, I would ban Grief, but then I would also realize that I have to ban a card from 4-color, and I think Up the Beanstalk is probably the one that makes the most sense. But why stop there? These elementals have really caused a lot of pain and suffering for a lot of people over the past, couple of years that they've been out. I'm just going to be completely honest with you. I don't know what they were thinking when they designed these cards. I understand that, maybe Up the Beanstalk hadn't been printed yet, and maybe they didn't fully realize how well they worked with Not Dead After All, Ephemerate, all that kind of stuff. But here we have Fury. I think this is going to be the last card that we're going to discuss today. Now, if you've already chosen to ban a card from Scam and ban a card from 4-color, I don't know that this is necessary, but what I like about it is it's kind of a hit to both decks, because the Scam deck plays 4 copies of these. It has, redundancy on evoke creatures that pair with Not Dead After All, and there are a lot of decks when your Rakdos opponent is on the play and they go turn 1, Fury, Not Dead After All, they have a 4/4 double strike. There are a lot of decks that just are stone cold dead to that. They just don't have an out. Like Tron, for example, that's going to race them before they get their engine online. And it does create this massive amount of pressure, so it's very good in the Rakdos decks, and it also happens to be very good in these 4-color decks. It's a 5-mana spell that you can cast for free that triggers Up the Beanstalk. It also, the 4-color decks don't play any sort of blink effects or anything like that, but it's just a good value card. It's a way to push out creature decks, and I think that is maybe the other big reason, is not only is it a prevalent card in the two top decks in the format, but it's also kind of a card it almost feels like a gatekeeper, right? Fury is, again, memes aside, the reality of it is Fury is keeping a lot of decks out of the format, whether you want to believe it or not. It 100% is. There are plenty of, creature-based strategies that if Fury ceased to exist, that would definitely pick up more in popularity and would be a lot more playable. So, I think from gameplay standpoint, from metagame share standpoint, and just from, like gatekeeping and keeping certain decks out of the format, you could stop at Grief and Beanstalk, excuse me, but I would go one step further and I would get rid of Fury as well. And, we can have a conversation later on about the rest of the elementals. Again, I think they're pretty horrendous designs, but for now, I think Grief, Fury, and Beanstalk would be what I would like to ban. And now we get to the fun part of the video, because after all that being said, what do I think is going to happen on Monday? I'm going to be honest with you, I don't think there's going to be any changes. As much as I would like to see a very, very big shakeup in the format, because we haven't really had one in quite some time, with the exception of the printing of Lord of the Rings, there was definitely some cards in there that made some moves, and then I guess Beanstalk as well. But just overall, there hasn't really been any sort of like taking decks down a notch, and because of that we see a lot of the same decks that we've seen over the past couple of years rise to prominence: 4-color, Rakdos, etc., etc. Now, even though I think the format could use a really big shakeup, and I think it's not in the best spot right now, why do I think nothing's going to happen? Well, that's because we are in the middle of an RCQ season. Now, a lot of people will, check the schedule, and they'll go to wizards.com or wherever they find their event locator, and they'll look at all of these RCQs that they want to play over the next couple of months, and what will they do? They'll go to a store and they'll buy a deck. And if that person who bought an entire deck planning to play an entire RCQ season, halfway through the season you tell that person they can't play their Rakdos deck or they can't play their 4-color deck, they might be done. They might not come back. And you get a lot of people who really don't trust WotC and their philosophy behind bans. So yes, I really do think that the modern format could use a big shakeup, but at the end of the day, I really think that the most likely outcome on tomorrow's ban list is going to be no changes. I hope that's not the case, and I definitely will be doing a live reaction tomorrow as soon as it's ready. I think it'll be ready at 10, so look out for a video probably somewhere around noon or 1 right before I go to stream on twitch.tv/doomlink, by the way, if you want to check it out. And yeah, so see if my predictions were right. Hopefully hopefully I'm wrong. Hopefully they do something. But in any case, I will see you next time. Peace.